January 17, 1943, Naval Air Station, Glenview, Illinois. The winter sky hung low and colorless over the frozen runways, a pale shroud of cloud that seemed to press down upon the earth itself. In the bitter cold, maintenance crews stamped their boots against the concrete, breath rising in white plumes as they worked quickly, efficiently, their hands numb despite thick gloves. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the metallic bite of frigid air. And there, gleaming under the weak morning light, sat rows of new fighter aircraft, sleek, powerful, their bent wings folded upward like the talons of predatory birds at rest. The Chance Vought F4U Corsair, America's answer to the Mitsubishi Zero, the machine that would, they promised, reclaim the skies over the Pacific. Inside the ready room, young pilots, most barely 20 years old, gathered around a senior instructor who spoke with the clipped precision of a man who had seen combat. He gestured toward a technical drawing pinned to the wall, tracing the aircraft's inverted gull wing with one finger. "Fastest naval fighter in production," he said. 2,000 horsepower, 415 miles per hour, in level flight. Nothing the Japanese have can touch it. The ensigns nodded, eyes bright with anticipation. They had trained for months on docile trainers, had studied dogfighting tactics in classrooms far from the thunder of war. Now they would finally fly the machine that would turn the tide, the aircraft that would sweep the rising sun from the sky. None of them yet knew the price that machine would demand. For nearly 2 years, American naval aviators had fought at a desperate disadvantage. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 had proven itself a revelation in the early months of the Pacific War, a fighter so maneuverable, so light and responsive that it could outturn anything the Allies put into the air. At Coral Sea, at Midway, at Guadalcanal, American pilots in their Grumman F4F Wildcats had fought with courage and determination, but always with the knowledge that in a turning fight, the Zero held the edge. Japanese pilots exploited this advantage ruthlessly. They would bait American fighters into low-speed dogfights, then loop and roll with an elegance that seemed almost casual, almost contemptuous. The Zero could sustain a turn at speeds where American aircraft would stall and tumble from the sky. It climbed like a rocket, danced like a hummingbird, and killed with the cold efficiency of a surgical instrument. The US Navy understood that superior tactics and courage alone would not win this war. They needed a machine, a fighter that could match or exceed the Zero's performance, that could carry the battle to the enemy and win not through maneuverability alone, but through raw speed and firepower. The Bureau of Aeronautics issued specifications: maximum speed, heavy armament, long range, and carrier compatibility. Chance Vought aircraft responded with a design so radical, so ambitious, that it seemed almost science fiction. A massive Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, the most powerful radial engine in production, driving a 13-foot propeller. To provide ground clearance for that enormous propeller while keeping the landing gear short enough for carrier operations, the designers bent the wings in an inverted gull configuration, creating a distinctive silhouette unlike anything that had flown before. 6 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings, armor plating protecting the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and speed, blessed, overwhelming speed that would allow American pilots to dictate the terms of engagement, to dive upon their enemies and vanish before the Zeros could respond. On paper, the Corsair was a masterpiece. In the flesh, it was a monster. The first hint of trouble came during the initial carrier trials. The long nose necessary to house that massive engine blocked the pilot's forward view during the critical moments of approach and landing. Carrier landings demanded precision, a controlled descent onto a pitching deck that seemed impossibly small when viewed from the cockpit. the landing signal officer's paddles the only guide in those final seconds. In the Corsair, pilots found themselves landing almost blind, the nose obscuring everything directly ahead. They learned to crab the aircraft sideways during approach, craning their necks to keep the deck in sight, then straightening at the last possible moment before touchdown. It was a technique that demanded perfect timing and nerve. Many did not possess either. The landing gear, those long, stalky struts necessary because of the inverted gull wing, proved treacherous. They absorbed shock poorly, and the slightest miscalculation in approach speed or angle would cause the aircraft to bounce violently upon contact. Worse, the right wing had a tendency to stall without warning at low speeds, causing the aircraft to suddenly drop and roll, just as the pilot was concentrating on the delicate ballet of carrier landing. The oleo struts would compress unevenly, the aircraft would veer sharply, and more than once a Corsair tumbled off the deck or slewed into the carrier's island superstructure, fire and twisted metal, bodies pulled from wreckage, empty chairs at dinner. But it was the engine, that magnificent, powerful, temperamental engine, that earned the Corsair its most bitter nickname. The R2800 generated such enormous torque that during takeoff, when the pilot opened the throttle, the aircraft wanted to roll violently to the left. Inexperienced pilots, their hands tightening on the stick in the excitement and tension of their first launch, would fail to apply sufficient right rudder to counter the torque. The aircraft would begin to roll, the left wing would dip toward the deck or the water beyond, and in that crucial moment, when the plane was too fast to abort but too slow to safely fly, the pilot had perhaps 2 seconds to correct. Most ensigns, their training hours still countable on 2 hands, did not have the instinct, the muscle memory, the intimate understanding of the machine's temperament. The Corsair would snap left, the wingtip would catch, and the aircraft would cartwheel in a grinding cascade of metal and flame. On the ground, it was survivable, though rarely without injury. On a carrier deck, it was almost always fatal. Ensign Eliminator, the pilots began to call it. The name spread through ready rooms and officers' clubs from Pensacola to San Diego, spoken with dark humor that barely masked genuine fear. Young men who had dreamed of aerial combat, who had imagined themselves diving through clouds to strike at the enemy, now found their greatest adversary was the machine itself. They would watch their classmates die, not in glorious combat, but in humiliating accidents, killed by their own aircraft during routine operations, their bodies burned or crushed before they ever saw an enemy fighter. The Corsair, designed to kill Zeros, was instead killing the men who flew it. Statistics told the grim story. In the first year of operational service, the F4U Corsair's accident rate exceeded its combat loss rate by a devastating margin. For every Corsair lost to enemy action, 3 were destroyed in accidents. Training squadrons reported fatality rates that shocked even hardened combat veterans. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics faced a cruel paradox. They had created the finest fighter aircraft in the world, a machine capable of dominating any enemy it encountered, but they could not safely operate it from carriers, the very platforms it had been designed to serve. The young pilots pressed forward regardless. They had volunteered for this, had raised their hands and sworn oaths, had kissed sweethearts goodbye, and promised to return covered in glory. They could not turn back now, could not admit that the machine terrified them more than the enemy. So they climbed into cockpits each morning, hands steady despite the fear, and they learned. Those who survived learned to anticipate the torque, to apply rudder instinctively, to sense the aircraft's moods and temperaments. They learned to approach the carrier deck with one eye on the landing signal officer and one on the instrument panel, watching airspeed like a hawk watches prey, knowing that even 5 knots too slow could trigger that deadly wing stall. They learned to respect the machine, to treat it not as a servant, but as a dangerous partner that demanded constant vigilance. And slowly, gradually, the Corsair revealed its other nature. When properly mastered, the F4U Corsair became precisely what its designers had promised, an instrument of aerial supremacy. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it was devastating. The massive engine pushed the aircraft to speeds no Zero could match. American pilots learned to use this advantage ruthlessly, diving from altitude, firing a long burst from the 6 wing-mounted machine guns, then using excess speed to climb away before the more maneuverable Zeros could respond. Boom and zoom, they called it. No turning fights, no elegant aerial ballet, just pure physics, energy and momentum translated into killing power. The Corsair could absorb tremendous battle damage and continue flying, its armored cockpit and self-sealing tanks protecting the pilot from wounds that would have doomed a Zero. And the firepower, 650 caliber machine guns, could saw a Japanese fighter in half, could shred wings and fuselage in seconds of sustained fire. The Marine Corps, desperate for capable fighters to support their Bloody Island campaigns, took the Corsairs the Navy deemed too dangerous for carrier operations. Marine squadrons operated from land bases where the longer runways and absence of pitching carrier decks made the aircraft's vicious handling characteristics more manageable. In the skies over Guadalcanal, over Rabaul, over the Solomon Islands, Marine Corsair pilots began to achieve kill ratios that seemed almost impossible. 10-1, 15-1. Japanese pilots who had once owned the sky now found themselves outmatched. The Corsair pilots would appear from nowhere, diving from the sun at speeds that made interception impossible, their guns hammering, and then they would be gone, climbing away faster than any pursuit. The Zeros, for all their grace and maneuverability, could not catch them, could not run from them, could not fight them on equal terms. By mid-1944, as American pilots accumulated experience and training programs evolved to emphasize the Corsair's unique demands, the accident rate began to fall. The Navy, watching the Marine Corps' success with envious eyes, quietly reconsidered its earlier decision. New carrier landing techniques were developed. The approach was refined, the aircraft's flaps and trim tabs adjusted, the landing gear strengthened. And finally, more than 2 years after the Corsair's first flight, the Navy began deploying it aboard carriers. The Ensign Eliminator became the instrument its creators had always envisioned, a carrier-based fighter capable of achieving and maintaining air superiority against any opponent. In the war's final year, Corsairs operating from carrier decks struck at the Japanese home islands themselves, their guns raking airfields and coastal installations, their presence in the sky above Japan a visible symbol of American industrial might and martial prowess. The same aircraft that had killed so many young American pilots in training now killed Japanese pilots by the hundreds in combat. The transformation was complete, but the cost had been paid in blood and broken bodies, in training accidents that never made the newspapers, in graves at Pensacola and Corpus Christi, and half a dozen other training bases where the wreckage had been cleared away and the runways washed clean, and the next class of ensigns climbed into cockpits, their hands gripping the stick, their hearts pounding as the engine roared to life and the voice of the instructor crackled in their headsets. "Remember your right rudder! Remember what happened to Johnson last week! Respect the machine!" The irony was not lost on those who survived to tell the story. America had set out to build a fighter that could beat the Zero, a machine so fast, so powerful, so heavily armed that Japanese pilots would flee at its approach. They succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, but in doing so, they created an aircraft so demanding, so unforgiving, that it killed more American pilots in training than the Zero ever could have. The enemy they sought to defeat in the sky became, for a time, less dangerous than the weapon they wielded against it. There is a photograph taken in late 1945 after the surrender. A Corsair sits on the deck of a carrier, its wings folded, its propeller still. Painted on the fuselage are rows of small Japanese flags, kill markings, each one representing an enemy aircraft destroyed. There are dozens. Beneath the cockpit, in neat white letters, someone has painted a name, Widowmaker. Both tribute and warning, both boast and confession. The Zero had been designed as an instrument of conquest, light and agile, sacrificing protection for performance, betting everything on the skill of its pilots and the shock of its initial victories. The Corsair was designed as an instrument of industrial warfare, heavy and powerful, armored and armed, a machine that embodied American abundance. Surplus power, surplus speed, surplus firepower. Where Japanese factories struggled to produce enough aircraft to replace combat losses, American factories churned out Corsairs by the thousands. Where Japanese pilots, their ranks thinned by attrition, grew increasingly desperate, American training programs, brutal and costly as they were, produced pilot after pilot, each one more skilled than the last. The Corsair became more than just an aircraft. It became a symbol of a certain American philosophy of war, that victory comes not through elegance or efficiency, but through overwhelming force, through the willingness to pay any price, to expend any resource, to sacrifice even your own young men in pursuit of a weapon so powerful that it cannot be denied. The machine did not care about its pilots' inexperience. It did not make allowances for youth or fear. It demanded mastery, and it killed those who failed to achieve it. And yet, once mastered, it granted its pilot a kind of invincibility, the ability to engage or disengage at will, to strike with impunity, to own the sky. In the end, the Japanese Zero was defeated not by superior tactics or braver pilots, but by an American machine so powerful it killed its own before it could kill its enemies, and still emerged victorious.